Welcome to What's on Your Bookshelf with your hosts, Denise Russo, Andy Hughes, and Scott Miller.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf, a podcast series dedicated to leadership development and finding your purpose. Alongside Denise Russo and Scott Miller, I'm Andy Hughes. Thank you so much for joining us here again. In this podcast, Scott, Denise, and I, we discuss a lot of different topics related to finding your purpose. But instead of purpose, I think today's general theme is people. We're going to give you a lot of recommendations on books and articles as well so that you can reference them after listening to this episode. We're on Spotify, so please subscribe to ensure you never miss an episode. And trust me, when we're talking about this book, it's called Everyone Communicates, Few Connect by John Maxwell. We could probably spend about 10 episodes on this book alone. But we're definitely going to be doing multiple episodes, so stay tuned for that. But we really appreciate you coming on here. Before we kind of dive in to this particular book, we thought it would be good for you, the listeners here, to learn a little bit more about us. How did we get to know each other? And Scott, if you could maybe go into that story a little bit. It's kind of a cool story to learn how we all know each other.
Hey, Andy and Denise. Happy Friday. Hope you're both doing well today.
It's Friday. We're really happy to be here.
Every day is Friday to me.
Yeah, so this was a topic that we kind of got to talking about after getting this podcast kicked off was really how did we all meet? And so I originally started under Denise's team, and we got to know each other a little bit as far as my multimedia background, and Denise always has great ideas. And one of the things that Denise really wanted to start was our very first podcast, which was an internal work podcast. Then I was introduced to Andy, and Andy has his background in broadcasting. And so we were introduced. Do you remember who introduced us, Andy?
I'm trying to remember. I think there might have been a project, that wanted to do a podcast. I can't remember exactly, but somebody introduced us. Thank you to whoever that was, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has really kicked off something great. And so Andy and Denise and I started with the podcast that was internal called Let's Be Real, and we interviewed some amazing guests. Denise, tell us a little bit about the book we're going to be covering today.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much. So today's episode is all about this book called Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. This is a book by John Maxwell. And as you'll see, as you continue to go on the journey with us on What's on Your Bookshelf, we often will talk about the books that are on my bookshelf, which is how this concept came to be. And many of the books on my bookshelf, in fact, over 50, probably closer to 100 of the leadership books on my bookshelf are books that have been authored by John Maxwell. He's the #1 leadership author in the world and is somebody that I've been able to be personally trained by and certified by. And in fact, that's how I met Andy. So this book that we're talking about today was a part of a leadership development program, a year-long program that I developed with a team that I led in my former job. And Andy was a participant as a leader in that program studying this book. So it's just really perfect for us to bring this back full circle and around. I've been studying leadership development for, 20 something plus years. I don't want to say how many past 20, but it's more than 20. And all of the podcasts that we have that we're sharing about typically are about books that have either inspired me or that somebody has recommended to me. Like one of the recent episodes that we had was about finding the center of your purpose. And that book, Ikigai, was actually another book that had been recommended to me in the leadership development program that I had created through one of the students that came through that program. So it's a really interesting way for us to share this information. In fact, at the same time that I had that program, I had developed a magazine, an interactive leadership magazine called Influence, because John Maxwell says that influence is leadership. The definition of leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And so that's what I entitled this magazine that I created. And one of the parts of the magazine was a column that I wrote called What's on Your Bookshelf. And it was really about the books on my bookshelf, which led it to becoming this active, living podcast that we have here today. So, Andy, how about for you? Do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like going through that program, a little bit about the book, and then maybe we dive into it?
Yeah, definitely. And I absolutely love this book. I had never read it before until I went into that leadership development class. And like I said, I mean, I could probably go all day about this book, but it was cool because we did go through every chapter and we had, discussions, and it was always great to hear from other people, their perspectives on it and stuff, and just different examples. I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways from it was the power of asking questions. A lot of times when you're in a leadership position, there's like this myth that the leader's the one that's just supposed to talk the whole time and, you just talk to people. But really, that's not how it should be at all. In my personal experience, learning how to ask, really good questions, you can just really get so much out of a person, and not even only in a work setting, but just personally as well. John talks a lot about not assuming things as well. And that's always a good tip too, because it's very easy to assume maybe someone knows something or anything like that. So for me, that was a really big one that honestly, I really try to practice every day if I can. Just asking lots of good questions to get really good answers and really dig into whatever, I want to learn about. So I just think that the power of asking questions is extremely powerful, and it's not really something that I thought about. And I think with the concept too, like, it sounds so easy. Okay, just ask a lot of questions, but really it can be hard to apply sometimes. So for me, that was one of my big takeaways from this book. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's super interesting that you said it, Andy, because one of John's other best-selling books is called Good Leaders Ask Great Questions. And it's interesting that what you took out of this book, which is about everyone communicates but few connect, that what you discerned from it was asking good questions. And so that's another good book recommendation. Maybe, Scott, we should throw that into the show notes as an extra read for some people. And maybe we do a podcast in the future on that one, because I agree that it's not just about telling, it's about asking. In fact, I think today it would be really interesting for us to talk about some things that are in the environment of work now and today. But before we jump into that, Scott, what are any of your thoughts before we start talking about some of these principles?
A couple of the things that really stand out to me from this book was really understanding the value that you can bring to someone else, and understanding what it is that you have that they want, and reframing that instead of what do they have that I want. Oftentimes, you meet people and they're very charismatic. There was a time I can remember a couple of years ago, I was down in Destin, Florida, and I was on vacation, and we jumped on a boat to go on a dolphin cruise. And this boat captain was just the most charismatic guy ever. And I kind of got to thinking about it after reading this part. And I just remember how charismatic this guy was. And he could, connect with anybody on the boat. And it turned into tips. All of these guys, these boat captains and the crew, are all working for tips. They don't get a salary. And so this is something where with a boat crew like this, they have to connect with people in order to make their money. And I just thought that was so cool. And it's like, if I could be like that guy and be able to connect with people like that instantaneously, that would be awesome. But is that going to come off as authentic for me? Being an extreme introvert, probably not. So I think that's something where I have to kind of reframe this for myself and figure out what it is what people value in me.
I love what you're talking about with that, Scott, on authenticity. And in fact, I have a boat captain story too. A couple weeks ago, I went over to Universal Studios because Scott and I have the pleasure of living in the most beautiful state, Sunshine State. And so I'm
jealous.
Yeah, sorry, Andy. It's really nice outside today too.
I
as
love
look
that
out
place.
the window.
Universal's the best. That's a great
Universal's
place.
amazing. In fact, maybe we'll do a live podcast one day from there. You guys come visit. So I was at Universal a couple weekends ago, and I really just needed to decompress from some things that have been transpiring over the last month. And I thought I'm just going to go over there. I have no plans to go battle the crowds, ride the rides, get exhausted. I really just wanted to go. And one of the things I love to do when I go to the parks is just ride the boats to the hotels. It probably sounds really old fashioned and nerdy and not fun, maybe for the people that really love the thrill rides, but I love to just go on the boats and look at nature, which is an element that a lot of people miss when they come to the theme parks because they're really rushing to get everything they paid for out of their ticket price. And for me, it depends on what you think are you paying for. You're paying for an experience. And in this particular visit, I had, similar to what you were saying, Scott, although this guy wasn't getting paid tips, it was his job. I met the boat captain that was taking the boat literally from City Walk, which is like the center of Universal, just to the hotels and back. Now, I've been on many of these boats where the boat captain, whether it's at Disney or Universal, come on the microphone and just simply say, thanks for being here. The next stop is so-and-so hotel. Please stay seated until we dock the boat. But this guy happened to just be that guy that could connect. So he started having a chat with me and my husband on the boat. And he was talking about how he had grown up in Jamaica and his neighbor was Eric Clapton, and that he'd been around celebrities all of his life and he'd been in the military, and he was just sharing stories. It's really, connecting was about sharing these stories. And we got to the place where it was like the end of the road, if you will. And we were so fascinated by this guy. We said, hey, can we just stay on the boat and just listen to you and talk with you? And he was, I think, a little bit dumbfounded. And he said, sure, you could stay on the boat. Like, don't you want to get off at your hotel, or don't you want to go ride rides? And we shared with him that we specifically were there just to ride the boat. And so we ended up riding the boat for 6 trips with this guy. And at the end, we got his information. He got ours. We became friends. We became friends with the boat captain, all because he wasn't just communicating information. He connected with us at a deeper level. And in fact, John says in the book, in the very beginning on page 11, he says, quote, people whom I saw connect with others had better relationships, experienced less conflict, and got more things done than those who didn't connect. And in fact, I was thinking that today, Scott and Andy, we talk about the first 2 principles that are in this book. Principle number 1 is that connecting increases your influence in every situation. And number 2, that connecting is all about others. And as I think about those 2 principles, Scott, the story you just told, or the story I told, was really about somebody connecting, but putting their energy into others. And then Andy, when you were talking about the programs that you were a part of as a student and now as a leader of that content, is about how you influence others in every situation. And sometimes the situations that we find ourselves in are not always positive or pleasant, right? We're dealing right now in society with a lot of people transitioning in their jobs. There's been a lot of people that are unhappy or dissatisfied. That's why there started the Great Resignation, moving into silent quitting. And the third phase was a lot of people losing their jobs and being laid off. And so I'm curious, as we talk about connecting, increasing your influence, and connecting being all about others, if we explore maybe what it would be like to be an authentic leader and connect at deeper levels and not just communicate information, especially when things sound tough. So how does that sound if we talk about that today?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great topic. I feel like it's just so relevant to today's world with all of the layoffs that we've seen. So yeah, I think it's a great place to talk about.
All right, well, let's dive into that. So I read recently an article that was mentioning this person named Minda Zetlin. She's the author of a book called Career Self-Care: Find Your Happiness, Success, and Fulfillment at Work, which is interesting because we talked about that in one of our recent episodes about how to find the center of your purpose has everything to do with not just being good at what you're good at and not really just liking what you like doing, but being in a culture and an environment where you're around people that you care about. And so recently she had published an article in Inc. magazine where she referenced some things that the best bosses always do during layoffs. And the information that she referenced came from, according to Yale management and organizational behavior expert Heidi Brooks. And some of the things that I discerned from that article were 5 main takeaways. And maybe we talk about those things briefly. The first is that you were talking, Scott, a minute ago about understanding the value you bring and what do you have that people want. And one of the principles that Heidi Brooks talked about from Yale Management School was that you begin with empathy. When we think about what just recently happened for a lot of people, thousands of people have been displaced from their jobs. And as a leader, if the number one thing you do is begin with empathy, both for those who are leaving the organization, but also for those who are staying in the organization. So I wonder if one of you or both of you might be willing to talk about that. Maybe Andy, you're a people leader.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you, knowing that you've seen people leave and you've also seen people that have stayed that may have certain feelings about the situation? What are you doing as a leader to begin with empathy?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And it was definitely, that was a first for me, going through something like that. And I think for me, a lot of it did start with empathy. You try to put yourself in everyone's shoes. And in some ways, I guess, if there is uncertainty, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you're in it together, right? Like sometimes there might be uncertainty for everyone, including myself. And so I think really you have to come together and just offer support, that, hey, I'm here. I understand that this is a difficult time, but, we're here. We're going to get through this together. I think offering that support and just really putting yourself in another person's shoes, that really can go a long way because sure, everybody knows that might be difficult. But, at the end of the day, you have to be there for support and just be there. If it's, if we need to have like a conversation about it or whatever we need to do, let's do it, So I think it's just having that open communication and being honest and offering support. Those were really I would say the main things that I was really trying to do during that time. It was difficult, but I always say no matter what the situation is, there's always a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. Mm-hmm. And in a situation like that, where your job is on the line, that obviously impacts your livelihood. It's really important to do it the right way. And it starts with empathy.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, John Maxwell often quotes Maya Angelou and says that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And sharing empathy in times of transition really can show that a leader cares for the people that they serve, because leadership is about influence, but it's also about serving. So the number 2 principle that I got from the article, I think I'll swing over to you, Scott, on this one. So communication is sometimes about telling people something, but connection is often about listening. And so one of the attributes of a good leader during difficult conversations is to simply be able to ask, how are you doing? Really? So not just surface, like, I don't know, you often talk to people and say, oh, hey, how's it going? But do you really mean it? Like, what if they actually gave you a real answer? So maybe in the connection piece of this, that if you're a leader that is sharing communication, but you're connecting at a deeper level and asking people, how are you doing really? And then waiting for a response. When I think about you, Scott, one of the things that I value so much about you is that your ability to connect with others comes from a place of genuine and sincere, authentic care for another person, which is probably why you are a brilliant instructional designer. I know you mentioned earlier that you're more of an introverted kind of a person, but a lot of what you produce to the outside world through your designs comes from your care and from your listening and from your asking good questions. And so I'm curious what you think about this second principle about communication being about telling, but connection being about listening.
Yeah, Denise, this is something that really affected me, especially with the recent layoffs and your situation. And I really just wanted to be able to support you the best way I could. And I kind of felt like I had this survivor's guilt. So it was a very tough place for me when I first started talking to you about this. And the best thing felt like I could do at that time was really to just be that listening ear, be supportive, and give you that time to process through. And that was something that I felt like I could really do to help you out in this situation. It's just be that listening ear and be present as a friend.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It actually brings up point number 3. And since you mentioned my situation, is that point number 3 that I took from Heidi Brooks was that connecting deeply with others is about helping other people. And people who are laid off suddenly feel cut off. So whereas I know that there is this scenario and story like you were sharing about this maybe guilt of staying, for those of us who have been laid off in the workforce, there is a sense of being cut off. And so when you think about people leaders, it's not just about taking care of the people that are staying, but it's making sure that we have that empathy from tip number 1 for the people that are leaving, because oftentimes people have worked in places for a really long time. They've maybe had daily conversations or multiple times a day conversations with their team and with their leaders. I remember when I recently left my most recent job, what a sad going away it was for me to talk with my team, because we had deep connections. And I'm very blessed to say that all of the teams that I've worked with in my career over 30 years have always had a foundation of connection, not just communication. And it was really hard to leave, but I didn't feel cut off. I stay in connection with many of the people, including yourselves. But in times of transition, especially for people that get laid off, they feel cut off. And it's a really challenging position to be in. I can tell you, I've coached numerous people over the last 2 months that have this sense of feeling like part of them has not just been cut off, but has been taken away from them. And when you have these long relationships in the workplace, it's very hard to not only navigate towards what your purpose can be, but really finding your sense of self. So now if you're a manager, but you don't have good relationships with your team, then telling somebody that you care about them only once you let them go is not authentic. It seems disingenuous. And so this is really about taking the time when you do have the favor of having a team that has been placed in your care to build trust and build those relationships. Because only then, if there becomes a transition, even if somebody leaves to go to another job on their own free will, maybe they get promoted, maybe they get offered a better opportunity. So whether they're laid off or they leave on their own free will, if you don't build that relationship through connection, then saying goodbye somehow just is different.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think there's definitely a lot of work that goes into building those connections. And in a layoff situation too, you also have to think about even the people that were not laid off. They're also thinking about, okay, like, is this going to happen again? And so there's just so much philosophy to it. I'm glad you brought this up too, because actually yesterday I went to a Pittsburgh Pirates game with some of my team members, and 2 of the team members, I've been working with them for over a year, but I've never met them in person. It's all been through, virtual. One lives in Philadelphia, one's in Pittsburgh, and we had the opportunity. I got an opportunity to meet both of them yesterday in person for the first time, which was so cool. But it's funny because if I were to probably ask someone that was sitting around us, they would never know that because, we built those connections. It almost feels like we've known each other for years. So I just think it's really interesting. And I think this is such a big topic right now with so many people working virtually and how important building those connections are. It really just makes a huge difference. And that's why I just love this book so much. And that's why we're going to have another episode about it, because there's just so many good things in here.
Oh, so many good things. In fact, that reminds me of a story. Years ago, I went on a trip to Shanghai with another mutual former colleague of ours, Ava DeFonso, and I went to Shanghai on a trip when we were still with one part of our former company. And we went there to see people, like you both said, that we've never met face to face. Not only had we never met them face to face, but they lived in an entirely different country. But they were people that we had been working with for years and years. And when we first got there, I will never forget that the first day that we got there, people were a little bit timid. The culture in China is a little bit different than the culture of Italian American boisterous people that Ava and I both are. And the first day was all about just communicating, like, hello, it's nice to meet you in person. This is who I am. Who are you? Oh my gosh, I can't believe that you're so-and-so. Because remember, Zoom is also Teams is not really something that everyone had been accustomed to. So we had maybe had a lot of phone calls, but perhaps never seen each other, even in some cases where we knew the voice, but we had never seen the face. So by midday, we're hugging all the people in the office, which was also very culturally strange. And I remember one time somebody on the visit that we were there said, oh, we don't hug in our culture and definitely not in business. By the end of the trip, there was a lady who came up to us, and I'll never forget, her name was Cherry. And she had spent the week with us doing different activities, and we were really connecting on deeper levels. Like we broke bread. Well, not really bread. I guess we ate rice and other things like that. But you get the gist. We spent time together in China and learning about their culture and their food and their museums. It was so beautiful. And on that last day, she came to us and hugged both of us. And she started to cry. And she said, I wish she didn't have to leave. And I feel like we're family now. And that was just in maybe 10 days of a trip, but it truly created a connection that when we came home, it was no longer just about calling on the phone and saying, hey, can you deal with this customer escalation, or can you deal with this problem? Every conversation after that began with, how are you? How's your family? How are things where you live? It's so great to hear from you. And so you brought up a point, Andy, just now about what do you do with the people who have not been laid off in the scenario that we've been talking about. And this is where candid communication is necessary as a leader, because people can feel guilty, like you said, Scott, or maybe even resentful. I have to tell you, I have coached some people from different organizations that have engaged with me as a coach, that have shared with me that they feel almost resentful that they're stuck. Remember what we talked about in an episode on finding your purpose. You might be good at something, but not like it or not fit the culture where you are. And I have been talking with people over the last several weeks that feel a sense of like, I wish it was me, which is a really interesting take on the whole scenario. And so most certainly some people, to your point, Andy, I think they feel frightened, wondering if they're next, I think is the way that you phrased it. And uncertainty is hard on anyone. So as a leader, being open and transparent is so important. So I'm curious from your perspective, maybe each of you take this one. Andy, you as a leader, and Scott, you're somebody that works on multiple teams. How important is it for you that the leader, and maybe it's even the leader that you all work with, or not just you as the leader, but how important is it to you to be open and transparent in times of transition and uncertainty?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I mean, for me, everything's built on, open communication and honesty. And so, when we talk about being authentic, for me, it's It's one of the big things on my list, I would say, that, I'm looking for in a leader, especially during those times. You want to feel supported, even in those difficult moments. You want someone to be there for you and someone to have your back and support you and understand you and hear you out and listen. We obviously active listening. That's another huge thing for a leader. So for me, those are some of the concepts and qualities that would be important to me in those situations.
How about for you, Scott?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a unique situation and something that came to mind for me earlier, Denise, as far as authenticity and, transition and these types of things. I think this is something that a lot of people, even in the military, experience a lot, because I know when I got out of the service in 1996, this was something that I dealt with, which was, going from my division, which was pretty much kind of like my family. Mm. And then suddenly I was cut off and, they left on a deployment and I stayed behind and went home and I was completely cut off from everything I knew. And so there was this disconnect for me and it was starting over. And I think that's where a lot of people here, when we lose people that we're connected with, it almost feels like we're starting over again and reestablishing new relationships with people. I'm currently on a fellowship and I'm now establishing new relationships. When you brought me over to this team, and now it's very cool because I get to make new connections with people that I wouldn't have known otherwise. And so now I think for me, I look at this opportunity as something not as necessarily a bad thing anymore, like I used to. I think that comes with maturity. And then now I'm looking at this as more of an opportunity to make new connections with people.
I love that. Have you guys seen the movie Shawshank Redemption?
Yes.
Have you seen it, Andy? This is one of my top 10 most favorite movies of all time. And what you just said, Scott, reminded me of a part of the story, certainly not quite the same analogy that you gave from the military, but do you remember in the movie there was a time when the old man who was the librarian, and gosh, if his name isn't slipping me, but he ended up getting released from prison at a very old age and had spent most of his life in the prison where he was home. He was in charge of the books and he had made a lot of friends there. And when he was released, and I imagine this happens to a lot of people that leave an environment, whether it's military, like you explained, or even from prison, and this is why there's so many ministries, I think, that help with this type of thing, that when he was released from prison and went into his halfway situation, he was so lost and he was so unhappy and he was so lonely that he tried to commit a crime just to be able to go back to the jail. And it ended up being a much reverse story than yours, Scott, where you found the ability to seek opportunity in all of this and to seek things that maybe are manifesting as even better for you in the movie, without giving spoilers. But in the movie, obviously, he didn't do that. And an opposite thing happened to him. If you've never seen the movie, highly recommend the film. It's brilliantly done. And so this reminded me when you were telling that story about how when a connection is so deep for you, when it gets severed, what that does to you mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a stab in the heart in a way, just it's very impactful. And I think that just goes to show you how important these connections are. And even through difficult times, they can still live on. So there's a lot to take from that for sure.
So maybe just one last one that I took away from the article, and then we'll close it up for today, is that the fifth tip that I got was that you help the team feel connected to one another and the company. When you are a leader who is a part of a transition or a transformation, and you are left with a team that may have severed trust, maybe productivity is down even, the manager's job is to reduce panic and also not sacrifice productivity in the workplace. Productivity and trust are linked. In fact, a lot of organizations measure these two things. So you may communicate all the facts during a transition, but if your team does not trust you and does not feel connected to you, productivity will suffer. So the question is, does your team feel connected to the goals? Does your team have a shared purpose? Does your team understand the expectations? Because all of those things that you all just shared, which is about people having fear, anxiety, lacking trust, wondering if they're next, maybe work has been totally topsy-turvy because the people that left also left not only work on the table, but left intellectual property that now is being dumped on the people that stayed. So leaders, not just managers, must create a sense of community and connection and an ability to work through that during difficult times. And it's a sign of a leader's integrity. So any case, that's the last tip that I took from it, is that it really takes the community piece and the connection piece. And if you're disconnected on your team, if you're disconnected as a leader, if you're disconnected in your personal relationships, connection is the beginning point, right? Because being disconnected wastes your time. Have you ever been on hold, for example, with a bill collector or a company, like maybe you're like a hospital or something like that? Have you ever been on hold for a really long time and then the call gets dropped or disconnected?
Oh yeah.
Worst feeling in the world.
That's very frustrating.
It's the worst feeling. It's so frustrating. So staying connected is important, right? I could tell so many more stories, but we're out of time for today. So Scott, Andy, who would like to take us into the close here for some actions and maybe some wrap up on what we talked about today?
Yeah, no, I think we definitely touched on a lot of different things here today in terms of connections. And I think, yeah, it would be great to just maybe get an action item from everyone here as we like to do. What we've obviously, all of us are pretty familiar with this book, but I always think that there's always something that we can practice when it comes to this book. I think for me, I'd actually like to share this book more, because I feel like a lot of the concepts that are in this book are extremely relevant no matter what industry you're in or how old you are. There's so many great things. And I just want to share more of John Maxwell, period. I feel he also has some videos that he posts a lot. It's like even like 2 or 3 minute videos that are really, really cool. And a lot of them reference some of the concepts that are in this book. So for me, I would actually like to share this with more people because, for me, it was just a great book to read, very easy to read, and it made a huge difference. And I can only imagine how many people this book has impacted. So I'd love to just share it more.
I think that's a really great idea. You were mentioning his minute. It's called Minute with Maxwell.
Yep.
So if you're somebody who doesn't have time for podcasts or doesn't have time to read books, maybe you don't even have time to read a book summary, if you subscribe to the Minute with Maxwell, and I can give you a link, Scott, that we'll put in the show notes for how people can get that. I'll take myself a note on that people can listen to John giving one word, just a regular word that he explores for 1 minute and gives leadership lessons about it. In fact, that's what drove me to go and get personally certified and trained by him, was watching those 1 minute videos. And John says with this book, everyone talks and everyone communicates, but few connect. Those who do connect take their relationships, their work, and their lives to another level. So I agree with you, Andy, being able to share this content more. I think the action that I'll take away is being able to make sure that people know about our podcast and that people know about the resources that we share. One of the actions that I came up with from our last podcast was wanting to be able to help people understand the deeper dives. And so an action that I think I'll take for next time is being able to share what some of those things are in a deeper way, and for us to come up with maybe version 2 of this book. I think we have a lot that we can still do with that. Scott, how about for you?
Yeah, I think I'm going to stay on authenticity as my theme for this week, Denise. So John has a point where he says, what do I have that other people want? And I think this is really where we come down to that piece of authenticity. And there's a quote from Stephen Covey that says, it takes humility to seek feedback. It takes wisdom to understand it and appropriately act on it. So my challenge for myself and anyone else who wants to take this is go out and seek that feedback and find out what it is that everybody views as, what it is that you bring to a conversation, to a relationship, to draw people in that, really builds authentic connections with people.
Hey, Scott, I assume that people heard this podcast because we shared a link and it drove them to Spotify. Where are other places that people can listen to the podcast or where they could subscribe? And we would love if they would also share our podcast with others.
Yeah, Denise, you can find our podcast on Spotify, on Podcast Index, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Pocket Casts, Deezer, and Listen Notes.
Awesome. So let's make sure we list those in our notes as well in case people have a preference for where they reference this podcast. And again, we hope that you will subscribe, share, comment. We have a LinkedIn page called School of Thoughts Publishing. We'll put that in the notes as well, but we'd love for you to follow us along there and comment on what your takeaways are from the different podcasts. So Andy, how about we pass it over to you for any closing comments and to take us into tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this was a fantastic conversation. I first want to thank you both for being so open, and I just think it was a really great conversation to have, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people that have things to add about this book, or maybe just what you thought. So like Denise said, we'd love to hear what you think about the podcast and how you relate to it, any action items that you would like to take as well. And yeah, just thanks again for listening today. And this will be part 1. There will be another part of this book about everyone communicates, few connect. So be sure to subscribe, be sure to share, as Denise said, and we will see you next time on the What's on Your Bookshelf podcast.